Mr. Clerk, could you call item number 2, unless there's a representative from DHR or the Civil Service Commission here? Still none. All right, item 2.
Item number 2, resolution approving the award and execution of a $12.66 million four-year contract by the City and County of San Francisco through its Department of Elections to Sequoia Voting Systems Incorporated for the purchase of a new voting system and provisions of associated voting services.
We heard this item 2 weeks ago and continued it to today as there was an amendment of the whole at that time. Mr. Arntz, I understand there are some further amendments. Why don't you come and present this item to the committee?
Good afternoon. There was some changes to the contract from the last time that we were here. There was a subtraction of the voter verified paper audit trail items. And also there was a removal of some battery backup packs from this, and then there were some adjustments on the software maintenance fees. The total changes were about $750,000 from the changes, and the reason the changes took place was because there was a miscalculation in the pricing tables from the last time that we were at the committee. And so to not have an increase in the contract price, I sat down with Sequoia and tried to find a way where this contract would work, and if we were to approve it today and next Tuesday, that the city would have a system that it could rely on with all the necessary equipment and materials to be successful in using the system.
And this amendment does incorporate the requirement that we asked for relative to a full demonstration by February 12th?
Correct. Right.
Of ranked choice voting?
Yes. Right.
And if not, a withholding of $650,000?
Correct. Questions
from committee members? Supervisor Amiano.
Yeah, mostly comments, and then I do have a question for Mr. Arntz. And I know how important this is, and I know there's been a lot of jumping up and down in the press about this and the delay of the vote count and the allusion to the Secretary of State's adherence to accuracy over speed. And what I think what's incumbent on us is to try to not make that an either or. People do want and deserve to have the tallies as soon as we can, but it doesn't have to be at the sacrifice of accuracy. And I have some concerns that I'd like to express and then work with people on between the time I assume this is going to go to the full board, and see what Mr. Arntz has to say, because his opinion, of course, is very, very important. The last time the board rejected this contract, it was uncertain or not whether Sequoia could handle RCV. You know, we did participate in the demonstration today. That's a big issue for the board, and it does seem that things have changed for the positive. But you know, that's really owing to us that we really held people's feet to the fire. And so that's a positive, and they have agreed to a third-party inspection of the source code, and I think that's a step forward. I know some people are not satisfied with that, which is understandable, but this is not exactly a robust, vital industry. It's moribund, if anything, and we are the ones who really should be setting the standards, particularly given the state of that industry. On the open source subject, the push for open source is in its very beginning stages. This is not the end. In the interim period between now and what this contract last came up to us for a vote, I think a lot of us have been very educated around the issue and the necessity to have open source voting system as soon as we can. And I think there are a number of steps that the board can take to ensure that we move forward full speed to achieve greater voter security and confidence to get an open source system sooner rather than later. And it's going to take some serious planning and research. One thing is the open source ballots. Here's what I would like to push for, open source ballots for RCV. And what that means is, and Mr. Arntz has been doing it from time to time, is that the ballot images, which is anonymous record of each voter's ballot, will be put on the web so they can be downloaded by anyone, and that person can run the RCV tabulation for her or himself. This adds an additional layer to the level of redundancy to check and recheck election results. You would have the paper ballots themselves plus the printout at each precinct on election night, plus the memory packs where the ballot images are stored on the voting equipment, and finally ballot images on the web, all of them cross-checking with each other. I do think it would create a level of security that doesn't exist in any other election in the United States, and Director Arndt already has put the ballot images on the web for a couple of the previous elections, but right now it's left up to his discretion. So what I'd like to say to the public and Mr. Arndt is, while I'd like to make that requirement, I'd like to know what you think about that, because it's not really open source software, it's open source ballots, and I think that would be a step towards transparency. And I also think that by requiring this, San Francisco would be setting a new standard. So, Mr. Arndt, not to put you on the spot, but that's all we seem to do, not with any malintent. Would you be supportive of this idea of the board mandating the use of open source ballots when we get to that? Not today. We're not going to do it today. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. That would be great. And then the second recommendation and concern, and this isn't an amendment because it would hold up everything, is I really do think that we need to have this such a serious issue, a public interest voting equipment task force, and they could research the reliability of everything, plan for both open source software and the city becoming its perhaps its own vendor. And that's a very interesting idea I'd like to see on the table. Obviously not for this round, but if we could work with other cities and localities in the region and perhaps become our own vendor, because I really don't think we're ever going to get to the pure concept of open source, because I really think the vendors, it's not in their interest. It's how they make their money. And, if the most we can do is insist, but the best we can do might come up with a plan in the future so we could be our own vendors, and then we could, these things are not nickel dime, as you know. They're very, very, very expensive. And if we were our own vendor, we could actually sell equipment to other places, or at least give them licenses to do it, and it might even turn into a revenue source. Now, that's not a fairy tale, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. But I think issues like this, particularly with the rapid fluctuations of and advancements of technology, could demonstrate some vision around this issue. In other words, we got to deal with the crisis today, but what are we going to do in the future? So that's something I would like to recommend, and we could talk further at the full board and to Mr. Arts about a task force. So those are basically my comments on this matter.
So, Supervisor Amiano, you're talking about a piece of trailing legislation mandating open source ballots that you would introduce?
Well, I don't think we even need that. I think it's up to the discretion of Mr. Arnts for the open source ballots.
For posting the ballot images, yeah, that's not it. We do it now.
Yeah.
Right.
And then in terms of the task force, that I could put that in the form of an ordinance. But these are some of the things I'm thinking of, because we're not. I mean, to be candid, we're not going to make everybody happy here. I think there is a lot of pressure on all of us about the public inconvenience and the stress factor, of course, for the Department of Elections in doing a hand count. But I do think it's been presented as an either or. You have to have the speed at the sacrifice of the accuracy. How about working towards a reconciliation of both of them, and so that it's not an either or. Anyway, some of my thoughts on it.
Ms. Newman, on behalf of the budget analyst.
Supervisor Peskin, members of the committee, Deborah Newman from the Budget Analyst's Office. I would just note that the proposed contract with Sequoia is about $12.5 million, in addition to the about $5.5 million of federal and state grant funds. The city's general fund will be obligated to spend about $7.1 million over the next 4 years. In addition to that, part of the contract with Sequoia is for improvements of capital improvements for a warehouse as yet to be identified, likely to be Pier 48 at the port. There are no lease the elections and the port have not entered into lease arrangements for that port property, and the Department of Elections does not have funds for that lease. The lease would be about $750,000 a year, about $550,000 more than they're currently spending. So if we add that to the $7.1 million of general fund, it's about $9.2 million of general fund expenditures over the next 4 years. And the only one other point that we make is that the third-party review of the open source code, the city would be obligated to pay for that, and there is no estimate yet of the amount that would cost or the source of funding for that, most likely to be general fund. We've also made 3 minor recommendations for the amount of the contract, the date for the commencement and termination of the contract, and changing the date of the performance to be prospective.
Understood. Ms. Coloretti, you understand that if this committee forwards this to the full board, and we're the full board to approve this, and we're Mr. Arntz to enter into a lease with the Port of San Francisco, a supplemental appropriation would be required. You are prepared for that?
Yes.
Okay. I just don't want to hear about $231 million or whatever, because I don't believe that we are going to have $100 million that's not going to carry into next year, insofar as we don't even have a 6-month report. But you and I will have that conversation in my office today at 3:30. All right. Is there any public comment on this item? Scott Lube. I'm sorry, Supervisor Duffy, my apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to welcome Mr. Arntz back to the microphone, and I want to take a moment and thank Supervisor Amiano for his comments, because I think he captures really a lot of the challenges that we've faced, and I do feel that the board has taken a strong stance and had an impact as a result, and that it shouldn't be an either-or situation. I've had some people call me, John, and I don't think that they're really aware of some of the aspects of open source in terms of third-party review, and also in terms of the requirements that would be placed upon Sequoia pending the Secretary of State establishing those standards. And I wondered, just for the purpose of the record, if you would mind articulating that again for us.
The contract language was amended to include Sequoia providing its software source code to an expert third party to look for malicious code and also look for integrity of the code, and then to generate a report, which first the third party would share the report with Sequoia and the department. Sequoia would have, I think, 10 days to reply to that draft report, and then there would be a final report issued. If the third party found that there was malicious code or the software was otherwise insecure or needed mending, then at Sequoia's expense it would make the changes necessary, and also it would seek new certification if necessary to fix the issues. Also, if there's any change in state law, which is kind of obvious, then Sequoia would follow the change in state law when it came to open source or disclosed source software. But I think on a deeper level, if the Secretary of State were to promulgate any rules or regulations regarding open source or disclosed source software voting systems, then Sequoia is obligated in the contract to follow the promulgation of those rules and regulations. And there would be damages applied to Sequoia if they did not follow the Secretary of State's directives. And also, if our third aspect is if another vendor were to come forward in California during the term of this contract that had an open source or disclosed source system that was certified by Secretary of State's office, then Sequoia is obligated to disclose its software source code or to actually have its system developed in a way that it would be open source or disclosed source, and have it and bring it forward for certification at the federal level first within a year's time.
I want to thank you and underscore Supervisor Amiano's comments that our goal at the committee has not been to make things more difficult for you, but I think that there have been some really important principles at hand and concerns that extend beyond San Francisco, and so I appreciate that you've worked hard, and I think the committee really respects the work that you do running your department, and we appreciate the lengths to which you've gone to help make sure that there is integrity to the process. So I just want to really associate myself with what Supervisor Amiano has said and the leadership that Supervisor Peskin's also provided on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Duffy. Why don't we open this up to public comment? I'll call the cards in the order I received them. Scott Lubking, Ron Watt, Jane Morrison, Alec Bash, and then I'll call the next bunch.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. My name is Scott Lupking, and I'm a specialist in computer science on human-computer interaction. And I was one of the people that was asked to evaluate the voting equipment in Sacramento in July. I was focused on the usability of the voting equipment. Sequoia was one of the pieces of equipment that I evaluated. In my process of going through the evaluation, I ran across a number of problems on the usability of the voting equipment. These problems have been in Sequoia for a number of years, and Sequoia has been very reluctant to address the problems. Often they have stated they want to know who's going to pay them to fix their problems, which I think is a very poor attitude. I would suggest that as part of the contract that's developed with Sequoia, that there be some sort of arrangements made that when problems are identified in their voting equipment, that they fix the problems. I'd also like to recommend that there be a walkthrough of the voting equipment with the supervisors or the representatives. People are focusing on security of voting equipment, which is, of course, an important issue. Usability is another problem. And what I mean by usability is if someone is using the voting equipment and they get confused, they vote incorrectly, they are being disenfranchised. And there are a number of problems in Sequoia where people can make mistakes and get lost and may not necessarily know what is the appropriate choice. And before a final decision is made, I would strongly recommend as a professional in this area that members of the supervisor's office staff sit down and actually do a walkthrough. I did something like this with John Arndt's staff about 2 years ago, and when I trained them on usability of voting equipment, and they found it to be very informative. And this is why I would suggest that the supervisor's staff watch how the voting equipment is used so they can understand what the issues are. Would you have any comments of me?
Any questions for the speaker? Thank you, Mr. Lupking.
Right.
Appreciate your comments. Next speaker, please. Ron Watt, followed by Jane Morrison and Alec Bash.
Thank you very much for hearing me. My name is Ron Watt. I am a 12-year member of the Tehama County Elections Department. I have been trained by the Delarue Corporation in the usage and implementation of the Sequoia systems, so I am quite familiar with them. This $12.6 million contract is quite an error for San Francisco. These machines have been decertified. In Florida right now, you can buy the machines for $1 a piece because they are not going to use them anymore. The main reason that they were decertified is they are not security compliant. Architecturally, they cannot be made security compliant. Under HAVA, that was the original reason that we got these machines. Right now, Sequoia, in their demonstration here, showed that these are SIP and PUF compliant. However, they are only SIP and PUF compliant if the voter brings their own SIP and PUF mechanism. Therefore, you are disenfranchising any handicapped voter that cannot afford that. If you were to purchase these machines and this system, you will soon find that you are not HAVA compliant and would have to upgrade. I asked the Sequoia people down here in room 278 what the cost was between a Sequoia AVC Edge machine as it stands, as demonstrated today, and one that would include the sip and puff equipment. They had no idea, but fully agreed that it would be, quote, god-awful expensive. Right now, there is, before the Secretary of State's office, Lowell Finley, who is the chief investigator of the voting system technology, claims that Sequoia Systems violated election law in Tehama County in the 2006, November of 2006 election. Their system failed. They ordered the elections department of Tehama County to upload via unencrypted internet the entire elections results. They were sent via internet to Denver. Denver then by telephone called back and told the Tehama County Elections Department how to go in the back door and gave them the results to print out because the Sequoia system failed and would not print out the results. This is a violation of not only of state and federal law, but it is a system that is flawed and a company that is dishonest. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker, please. Ms. Morrison.
I know this is a complicated subject, but I wonder if you might consider doing a hand count in February and June. I know that the ranked choice voting complicates things a bit, but we don't have that in February or June, I think. We don't anyway. And it can be done quickly if you decide to count them all at once. And I think that would be much cheaper, save a few $1 million, and also be very trustworthy, and we don't have to worry about secret systems of voting machines. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morrison. Mr. Bash, followed by H. Brown, Chandra Fries, and Rich Matthews.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Peskin, members, and staff. My name is Alec Bash. I'm President of Democracy Action, which is the San Francisco chapter of Progressive Democrats of America. We appreciate the efforts that have been made to come to some accommodation of the very valid citizen concerns that have been expressed over the past year. We think we aren't quite there yet, and it really comes down to secret source code software, secret elections. You can choose to trust the results, or you can choose to be skeptical. But you cannot choose to know, because secret software continues to be prey to individual hacking and malfeasance in ways that do not leave any traces. We can certainly do more to increase these levels of trust, such as hand counting, some percentage spot checking the code, having a third-party attempt to unravel all of the elements of the code and ensure that there isn't anything there. But the hacking is always a potential thereafter. And the basic question is, do we want to get to assured accuracy in the voting or not? If we do, then secret software is not the way that we can go, given the frailty of the system, as some of the prior speakers have indicated. Hand counting is not something that we need to be afraid of. Hand counting happens in many places. New Hampshire is an example. If we were organized in San Francisco to do hand counting, we could certainly do hand counting very quickly. In the previous speaker, Jane Morrison's experience, they were able to have hand count results the same night as the election. And I think that we are afraid of hand counting because we have our technological fix, but that does not mean that we have to be afraid or that there is validity in that fear. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself in regards to hand counting, and I would urge the board to consider that carefully. I support strongly the concept Supervisor Amiano presented of having a task force looking into ways that San Francisco could become its own vendor. And I think there are some real opportunities there, and I'm sure citizens would want to work with the supervisors and city staff on that. But again, we urge you to not go forward with this contract, go forward in ways that are more guaranteed of the accuracy that we want and save the money that would be spent on the machines to ramp up a strong hand counting effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bash. Mr. Brown, followed by Ms. Freeze.
Supervisors, thank you. The United States lost 650,000 dead in the Civil War. That's our top killing field for Americans. Overall, we lost 350,000 in World War II. We lost 3,000 so far in Iraq. How many millions have we killed? Everybody that died or killed somebody fighting under the flag of the United States thought they were fighting for justice and equality and the right to vote. There is no more important issue in the United States or in the world than your right to vote and have an honest vote. Bringing these guys in to run your voting machines is like bringing Al Capone in to be in charge of prohibition. Their record is abominable. These are the people that created the hanging chads in Florida. Did you know that? Dan Rather did a really nice report on them. They manufactured ballots of inferior quality on purpose because they knew they'd screw up. Then what happened? Production people walked away and refused to do that. This is the same company sitting back here behind you. Princeton University last year was able to hack their machines in seconds. Seconds. We've got a problem. Our problem is that you're lazy. All of you are lazy. You're children of the computer age. You want everything instantly. You want a touch screen. Well, we counted ballots by hand for hundreds and thousands of years. We can count these ballots until, as Supervisor Amiano suggests, San Francisco pays for, and you can do it for $3 million, your own open source system, which you can then give as a gift to the United States. There's nothing more important than voting and trusting that your ballot will be correctly counted. Thank you.
I just wanted to jump in. Not just the city possibly in the future being its own vendor, but the state being its own vendor was an idea, a suggestion.
Ms. Freeze.
Yes, thank you, Chandra Freeze, San Francisco Voting Integrity Project. And I first want to express appreciation for the hard work you've done in taking a lot of our considerations about the integrity of our vote and trying to make this work with Sequoia. However, I just don't think that it really ultimately will give us the assurance that we need that our votes are counted properly. When it comes to our elections, San Francisco is a paper-based county. It will always be a paper-based county, and we don't have a problem with that. That's great. But we are an electronically tallied county, a black box tallied county, a proprietary software tallied county. And that's the problem, and I don't think it's fixed by the mitigations you've tried to include in the contract. A Zogby poll released in August of 2006 showed that 92% of Americans oppose having their votes counted in secret by secret vote counting computers. 80% say they want votes to be counted in front of observers representing the public, and that elections officials should not rely solely on the proprietary software that operates electronic voting machines that are presently being installed all over the United States. We want elections in which we can have confidence that the stated winners reflect the will of the people. Fast results are not a priority in and of themselves. While electronic voting systems may report results faster than hand counting, there is no assurance, nor can there be any confidence that the reported results are a true reflection of the will of the voters. Deborah Bowen's review found the Sequoia systems, quote, certified to inadequate standards, quote, security mechanisms were inadequate to ensure accuracy and integrity of the election results, quote, contain serious design flaws that have led directly to specific vulnerabilities, quote, lack reliable measures to detect or prevent tampering, quote, lacks effective safeguards against corrupted or malicious data, and on and on. What are we doing here with this? I was on a river rafting trip in Oregon this summer, and on my raft, the conversation was about climate change and election integrity, and that's what you get when you're on my raft. Two of the people on that raft said to me, you know, when our states do look at California to lead the way on all of these issues, and then our states are more likely to follow. One woman was from New Jersey, and one was from North Carolina. So on the other side of the country, we have people looking to us to lead the way because California is the state that has the guts to do it. So we implore you to lead, not to be held hostage by the computer companies. You are working for us. Please decline this contract unless it meets the standards of openness, transparency, open source software. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fries. Mr. Matthews.
Good afternoon, Rich Matthews. I serve on the Elections Commission, but I'm here as a private citizen. But I also want to mention that all supervisors either have received or will be in receipt of a letter from the Elections Commission unanimously supporting approving this contract. And again, just here to say that no matter what system we ever have to count our paper ballots, it's going to have a plug on it, and that plug is going to go into an electrical socket. So it's going to be some sort of an automated system, and the question is, what sort can it be, and also what kind of security arrangements can you build around it to ensure that it is doing its job? By state law, we have a 1% manual tally afterwards, after every single election, and in this case, it was 10-fold and 25-fold that. If we want to increase that, I would totally support that. But to suggest that we are solely beholden to whatever the computer code is just not true. There is a manual tally, randomly selected precincts after every single election, and again, if we want to do a broader sample, that would be great, and that would ensure greater integrity. And if there's some discrepancy, then we go to the paper ballot. So just anytime anybody wants to talk about electronic voting systems as one large catch-all term, I always want to invite them to take a look at, are you talking about a paper-based system or is it pure touchscreen? And if you have a difficulty with touchscreen in that it presents a black box problem, the answer to that isn't go open source. The answer to that is throw away that system and don't go touchscreen if you can't trust it, and I don't. So paper-based with manual rechecks afterwards provides excellent security, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews, in your capacity, not as a commissioner. Jeff Whittington, Tim Mayer, Brent Turner.
Hi, my name is Jeff Whittington. I'm an officer with a local grassroots group, San Francisco for Democracy. We're strongly in favor of open source, verifiable, secure voting, and opposed to the Sequoia contract. As I understand it, the Sequoia system is not certified by the Secretary of State, so I'm personally unclear as to why it's being considered. And our view is if San Francisco can't lead the way towards...
Sir, it is certified by the Secretary of State, not for ranked choice voting
not for
at
ranked
this
choice.
time.
Okay, I'm sorry. But our view is if San Francisco can't lead the way towards legitimate, clean elections, then who's going to? Thank you.
Hi, Tim Mayer. You know, I'm in District 8, Supervisor Duffy. So what's been happening here is there's so many fundamental problems associated with the counting and security of machines. It's hard for me to go over each one of them. But essentially, the operation always for elections has to be moving towards more and more transparency. And we can tell from previous elections and problems associated all over the United States that unless we move aggressively as the supervisors of San Francisco have done quite well, we won't get the kinds of security that we continually have to improve upon. So one of the things that I understood from this past election that just happened is we actually had some requirements from the Secretary of State that required us to recount a substantial number of our, to remake, if you will, a substantial number of our paper ballots. And that was because in the process of counting our IRV, unless you marked the ballot for all three choices, it kicked it back and we had to recount. And if I'm quoting the wrong number, I'm sorry, you can correct me, but I understood that it was 110,000 ballots were remade out of 158. Now, of course, if we have that kind of requirement, or any kind of requirement with a substantial number of manual remakes of ballots, my goodness, not even counting, but remakes, well, that's got to be the most ridiculous, insecure sort of operation that I could envision. So how do you know, in light of what has happened recently in terms of our recent count and what has happened in terms of the Secretary of State being quite disappointed with the security of our present vendors, that she's not going to require some substantial amount of effort for recounting and remaking and so on from this next election? Additionally, you know, the issue of vendor credibility, it's only going to get worse because more and more information is going to come out. So purchase of any new vendor systems would be folly given all of the information tendered by the various activists that you've heard from and will hear from as well. And, of course, the Secretary of State has said it's quite problematic. So what we're asking for, and I'm very much in support of Supervisor Amiano, that you take control, that you develop the open source transparent system so that you can keep your arms around it and keep improving it, because San Francisco supervisors are the only ones that are going to be totally motivated by secure and transparent systems, whereas vendors are always and must be motivated by profit first. Have to be. There's just no alternative to that. But with regard to money it's spent, I've heard some figures of 12.6, and we're going to have to spend 7.1 of that. Really, in the end, it doesn't make any difference what we spend, because voting is priceless. So whatever it is that we spend, that's what we need to spend to make sure our vote is secure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Turner, followed by Tajil Shah and Danny Schwartzman.
Hello, Brent Turner. Good afternoon. I'm a sustainability activist working on this voter confidence crisis. I'm a member of the U.S. Green Building Council, and I'm an eco-broker and also a member of Build It Green. Today I speak to you on behalf of the League of Young Voters, the California Young Democrats, the San Francisco Labor Council, the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, the Pacifica Peace People Coalition, Black Box Voting, Common Cause, the Election Defense Alliance, the Open Voting Foundation, Electronic Frontier Foundation, and the Sustainability Community. We've had open source resolutions passed by the California Democratic Party and for the central committees of the Democratic Party in San Mateo, Marin, Sonoma, and San Francisco counties. For the record, San Francisco County has endorsed open source code. I'm shocked and dismayed that our elections commission here would vote 7-0 for this purchase. We have requested that Mr. Matthews step down off the elections commission. We are alleging that he has a conflict of interest as his private company represents law firms that have intellectual property clients. The recent elections in Venezuela and Russia highlight the lack of transparency internationally. Here in San Francisco, we do have the benefit of a strong elections department and Director John Arnst, but this does not solve the transparency problem. The missing 18,000 votes in Sarasota, Florida could not be investigated due to the proprietary nature of the software code. These systems that we're considering are not HAVA compliant. The Secretary of State has concluded this system to be insecure. I can't believe that we're considering doing this. I don't know where the political pressure is coming from. Certainly looking into Sequoia's past, there's a great amount of concern. I consider this to be a law enforcement issue. We've been tendering this to the grand juries and to the Federal Bureau of Investigation as well as the local DA. I keep waiting for someone to show up and save us from this. I'm hoping that we do not go forward with this contract for the obvious reasons. We're also in touch with the Secretary of State's office. Her recent election is not a mandate for San Francisco to buy this system. She campaigned on a transparency platform that included open source, so I think she may be being misinterpreted. Certainly, we don't believe that her election became a mandate for this purchase. In a recent UC Berkeley workshop, 3 bugs were inserted into 100 lines of code. Only 2 were found. These are by experts. The work volume, the third-party disclosure issue, is a non-starter. That is a slap in the face, and I guess they don't think we're smart enough to understand the difference between partial and complete disclosure. When you're disclosing it to a small group of people, you have inherent problems. We've already seen the manipulation of the certification process, and we do not want the purchase to move forward at all. Finally, if nothing else, Santa Clara will rent us these machines. As a previous speaker alluded, these machines are being given away right now. So just to be fiscally responsible, at least continue conversations that are already occurring between the Department of Elections and Santa Clara, and think about renting, if nothing else. Thank you.
Mr. Shaw. Or Mr. Shaw, excuse me, Ms. Shaw.
Thank you, Supervisors. My name is Tejal Shah, and I'm on the Elections Commission. I just wanted to speak a little bit to the issues around open source. First, I feel like it's important to note that I am a huge proponent of open source and worked in the technology field and sold applications based on open source and worked with some of the founders of it. So this is not an issue of are you pro or anti-open source, and I think to make it that is an unfair for the Department of Elections and for the for the voting population in San Francisco. It is true that open source technology does make lots of things very soundproof and very protective and very sound. But the key piece around open source is that there is a community of engineers that are consistently working on it at a regular level, making sure that its checks and balances are placed, making sure that it's sound software. At this point in time, we don't have that product for our voting system. The Commission has labored over this issue. The Department has labored over this issue. And I feel like one of the things that this contract does is allow for the code to be present to people that can really understand the code. None of us can understand the code, to make sure that it is fair. And so I urge you to vote for this contract and to think about the long-term effects with the open source task force that will be developed, and really consider the long-term vision of how we create a software solution that works for us in the long run. But in the interim, this is a sound solution with a sound contract that enables us to have effective elections that's paper-based. And so I thank you, and I apologize for her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schwartzman, followed by Stephen Hill, and that is the end of my speaker cards.
Supervisors, I'm Danny Schwarzman with Open Voting Solutions, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this notion of disclosing software. There's somehow this image that a software engineer would read lines of code and determine whether the software is any good from that. Clearly, this is not very useful. When a software engineer looks at a collection of software, the question is, how can we look at this code thoroughly? The normal way to investigate code in an embedded system would be to have a debugging tool that actually allows somebody to step through the code, see inside the code what it's doing while it's operating. Now, this is far from the language that is being suggested here for open disclosure. We should demand, if you're going to go with a Sequoia, you should demand that they deliver their full debugging system and an operational system, that you can verify that the software is actually the same software, that it's running, that you can step through it and use all the tools that their engineers have in order to investigate the software. This is normal practice in the industry. In order to verify software, quality assurance needs to be able to both have an open system, a white box testing, and a closed system that they can verify. I would also want to mention that the language of the city charter requires that a system be capable of doing ranked choice voting if the city purchases it. I think that clearly that means certified to do ranked choice voting, not demonstrated with a quickie little demo. And I believe the city, the supervisors, would be acting in violation of the charter if they were to purchase this system now and not have a system that is certified for ranked choice voting. And this charter provision does not allow any kind of exception if the election does not include ranked choice voting. So the ranked choice voting must be in the system used in February and June as well as November. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker, please. And after Mr. Hill, Katie Hickox.
Good afternoon, supervisors. For some of us, this has certainly been a long road, and I think it's important for everyone to recognize part of what's going on here. If you look at the federal level, where a lot of the direction for things like voting equipment and election administration comes from, you see that it's even more chaotic at the federal level than it is even at the state and local level. Just to give you one example, the federal testing laboratories are called independent testing authorities, and yet two of them have given big donations to the Republican Party. So how independent is that? And this is just one example of many, many examples that many people here could give you of how at the top level things are really truly broken. And so that trickles down to us here at the local level, where suddenly you're faced with some very difficult decisions and have to decide as public officials what's the best course. You're in a situation where you really do have to think about how do you make lemonade out of the lemons that have been handed to you here. I think it's prudent to have both a short-term plan, a mid-term plan, and a long-term plan. And I think in terms of the mid and long-term plan, it makes a lot of sense to have a task force, because I think a lot of the people here have done a fantastic job of educating the community about the dilemmas that are here in front of us all the time about voting equipment and about open source and transparency and security. And you can't just walk away from that. I think we have to look at today as the beginning of something rather than an end of something if you decide to approve this contract. And the beginning of something means we have to have a task force that starts looking at more seriously how do we actually make open source happen. How does the city and county, what do we think about becoming our own vendor, either joining in consortiums with other counties or the state of California? Los Angeles County already is its own vendor. If they can do it, why can't we? The state of Oklahoma is its own vendor. If they can do it, why can't California? And so these, I think, are where the direction has to go. If you were to decide today that you want to go to open source, for example, it would take, in my estimation, a good 2 to 3 years, possibly longer, to really chart that out and design what that system is going to look like, and then to actually make it happen. So we actually are in a position where we can start today to make sure that if you do approve the Sequoia contract, that down the road, when this challenge is before us again, we have other options that are more based on substantive information about how to actually make this happen, and including, as I said, going to perhaps becoming our own vendor. Because really, if you want to think about how to get a handle on these sorts of things, there's no solution like doing it yourself. So I think in the short term, I think you could do worse than approving this contract today, because your challenges are either hand counting the ballots or going with the current system with the problems we just had in the November election. Out of those three, I think, as I said, approving this contract, you could do worse than that. But mid-term and long-term, really, I think, is where it's at, and that's where we have to start looking at things like this task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Ms. Hickox, and that concludes my speaker cards.
Good afternoon. Hello, Tom, Bevan, Aaron. Anyway, my name is Katie Hickox. I'm a member of Democracy Action in San Francisco for Democracy. And I'm sure you've already heard lots of people already say about how important it is not to approve this Sequoia contract. And it's just a terrible thing how much pressure is being put on all municipalities to approve purchasing these electronic voting machines. This would be a great opportunity for San Francisco to, again, be a role model in perhaps developing some sort of voting system that works, that's not hackable, that's secure, in which they have access to the source code. I just wanted to point out an article that I emailed you recently. I urge you to vote no on this contract. Don't even approve it for the general supervisor election, or what do you call it, December 11th. So
There's a 1988 article in the New Yorker that discusses problems with e-voting machines and tabulator machines. Where have we heard this before? The source code and local codes together tell the computers how to count the votes. Local public tests may or may not adequately test the local codes, but they do not test the source codes. The election equipment companies, which thus both sell and program the computers that tabulate public elections, have long contended in and out of court that they own the source codes and must keep them secret from everyone, including the local officials who conduct elections. In 1985, over 22 years ago, Jack Kemp, the president of then-based Berkeley CES, which was a leading voting machine company at the time, which warned in so many words that an outsider who got the company's source code could compromise elections with it. That's the bottom line. So, anyway, I think you're just better off counting the ballots by hand. If it takes 2 weeks, so be it. And then spend the next year or two putting together an RFP for an actual voting system that works, that's not hackable, and that is secure. Okay, and I appreciate everybody for taking the time to listen and considering. I know this is, the San Francisco Chronicle has been terrible in the media coverage. They've really been giving you guys a black eye on this thing. So I just wanted to point that out. And I'm really disappointed in the San Francisco Chronicle reporting on this because they are not giving the exposure to the problems with the electronic voting machines and the theft of our elections.
Thank you, Ms. Hickox. Are there any other members of the public who would like to testify on this matter? Seeing none, we will close public comment. Colleagues, members of the public, let me make a few comments. I made most of them at our hearing on this item a couple of weeks ago. Let me agree with Supervisor Amiano, one, that this is a very unstable time in American election voting technology. I think it will reach equilibrium. As I said a couple of weeks ago, this is not a great set of choices that is in front of us. Mr. Hill, I think, summed it up just right, that San Francisco can and should be a leader in the midterm and the long term. The reality is, whether it's Mr. Schwartzman or Mr. Bash, that open source voting technology that we all desire is not there yet. It will not be available to us for several years to come. San Francisco and the state of California may be at the forefront of that movement. But in the short term, we need a solution, and this is, I think, the best and only solution that is in front of us. And I want to remind my colleagues and members of the public that the way this contract is constructed, it can be terminated at any time, and Sequoia is required to buy the technology back. So if we have open source technology in a year, we can terminate in a year. In 2 years, we can terminate in 2 years. This thing might not see itself to the end of its 4-year term. Meanwhile, I think we have an imperative to not do what Ms. Morrison suggested, and I say it respectfully, which is to engage in long hand counts. We had a 10% hand count verification this time, and I think we can and should continue to do that in the interim. Meanwhile, colleagues, I want to hear from you, but it would be my inclination to send this contract to the full board without recommendation and then see what the will of our colleagues is next Tuesday. I agree. Supervisor Amiano agrees. Supervisor Dufty?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll agree, and I just want to also support Supervisor Amiano's suggestions for a working group, and also appreciate his request to Mr. Arntz as it relates to being able to look on the web and have that transparency. So I join you in sending it forward with that recommendation.
So why don't we then adopt the amendment of the whole and send it to the full board without recommendation? That will be the order of the committee. Mr. Clerk, next item, please.